Will you pray with me, please? May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts bring glory to you, God, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. So this week, I've been thinking a lot about a man I met 2 years ago on the rooftop of a mosque in the town of Nazareth, located in the region of Galilee, in Israel. The man's name is Ghassan Manasseh, and he is a Sufi sheikh. Ghassan was one of many incredible people I had the incredible privilege of meeting during my 2 weeks in Palestine and Israel. I was there on an interfaith peace delegation with 22 other folks from Santa Cruz, California, Jews and Christians, and our purpose was to meet with Jewish, Muslim, and Christian grassroots leaders who were working for peace among Palestinians and Israelis. It was an amazing trip, life-changing in almost every way. There are 2 things I remember most about Ghassan. The first are his eyes. Piercing, steady, strong, clear blue eyes, surrounded by deep and well-grooved laugh lines. The second thing I remembered was his story. Ghassan had been living in East Jerusalem with his family while engaging in interfaith peace work. Specifically, Ghassan was holding meetings in his house for moderate Muslim, Jews, and some Christians to begin discussing how they could work together to bring peace to their holy land of Jerusalem. People of the book, lovers of God, who came from a shared religious heritage. Their aim was to create a workable vision for peace, in the holiest of cities for all 3 traditions. He was making some progress with that group, and it was exciting work. And it was attracting a lot of attention from Islamic leaders who did not share his interfaith vision or belief that peace between these historic enemies was possible at all, really. They began issuing threats, accusing him of damaging the Islamic faith and demanding he stop, or else they would make him stop. He tried to dialogue with them, asking them how creating communities of love and peace and working for justice for all people living in the Holy Land could be damaging to the Islamic faith, and yet they continued to threaten him until one day they invaded his home. Ghassan was there with his wife and his family when 14 men came into their home, destroyed their computers, ransacked their books, and began to beat them physically. Through the beating, Ghassan and his family chose to remain nonviolent, remaining committed to interfaith dialogue, to justice, and the vision. I'm going to use this one. Remain committed to interfaith dialogue, to justice, and the vision that he believed God was calling them to. You don't have to do this. Ghassan told us, he said to his attackers during the beating, Allah is asking you to make a different choice. Eventually, the friends and family in the area heard what was happening and came and dispersed the attackers. Ghassan's family sustained significant damage to their property, to their bodies, to their person, and it became too dangerous for them to be in Jerusalem, so they fled to Nazareth. It was only 2 weeks after this attack that we met Ghassan. He was giving us a tour of the mosque in Nazareth, where was the new home for the peace work that he was doing. The reason why I remember his eyes so strongly is I was struck with how much compassion they held as he recounted this story to us. There was no hatred, no vengeance, no fear, and hardly any sadness even in his eyes as he relayed how his whole life had been unraveled and threatened. Instead, what they held was love. They think that loving the other is a threat to loving God, he told us. But how can that be? It is only in the eyes of the other that we can see God. It is only in the eyes of the other that we can truly see ourselves. For Ghassan, there was no reality other than the reality of connection, deep connection and oneness with God, oneness with each other. Even though he bore the marks of division on his very body, What he spoke for, lived for, and embodied was a message of reconciliation. And this was the message he was carrying to others within his own faith community, to remind them of the oneness to which they were called. I've been thinking about Ghassan this week because his message of oneness and reconciliation in the midst of division and separation is the same message I believe that the writer of Ephesians was sending to those who received that letter. Whereas Ghassan lives in the midst of a conflict between Jews and Muslims, the church in Ephesus was caught between opposing sides between the Jews and the Romans. Ephesus was in the heart of the Roman Empire, where rampant discrimination of the Jewish minority was the norm. The author of Ephesians was writing to remind the Gentile Christians, who were the majority of the church there, not to forget the church's Jewish roots. Reminds them that they, as Gentiles, were once outsiders, and that the discrimination and sectarianism operating in the culture around them was not to be reproduced in the church. In the midst of a climate of separation, alienation, discrimination, the writer of Ephesians calls the church to both speak to and embody a different reality, one of inclusion, harmony, and reconciliation. I wonder if this idea seemed somewhat impossible to the people who were receiving this letter. The conflict between the Jews and the Gentiles was considered intractable. It had existed for generations. Yet within this contentious setting of the Roman Empire, the letter of Ephesians lays out a vision for total reconciliation, not just between Jews and Gentiles, but for the whole world. It's true. The vision in the book of Ephesians is cosmic. It's a small book, only 6 chapters. I encourage you to read it. But in it, the author argues that it's God's plan for complete harmony of the entire universe. Harmony with God, harmony with each other, unity, complete unity. The writer goes on to say that not only is this vision possible, but that it already is. It has been accomplished through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. And the author goes on to say that it's the job of the church, with Christ as its head, to both represent that vision in the world and be the means by which that vision is accomplished. That's a big task. And I wonder if it felt intimidating to the people receiving this letter. Very early stages of the growth of the church. It feels a little bit intimidating to me, this vision. Really? Complete harmony in the universe? Total reconciliation among all peoples? That's the goal? That's what the church is supposed to be manifesting in the world? There's a voice in me that says, that's too unrealistic. It can't be. There are too many areas of the world in life that seem irreconcilable. When I think about the expectation or even the hope for total harmony and openness within the world, within the planet, those voices in our culture, in our media, that say impossible fill my head. Maybe you've heard some of these too. There will never be peace between Israelis and Palestinians. That history runs too deep. We will always be dependent on oil. We will always need to drill. You will never get Americans out of their cars. Science and religion, those two will never come together. On and on and on, the voices that point to division, despair, disconnection. And the thing is, those voices aren't just out there, they're in here as well. Or at least they are in me. I have moments of despair and discouragement when I say, Rachel, be more realistic. That can't possibly happen. And I downsize what I think is possible in the world or in my life. There are just things that seem too broken to be healed, too fundamentally separate to be reconciled. But the author of Ephesians holds out a different possibility, one of complete harmony and unity. And into that possibility, there is a prayer that is offered that we heard Tinley read. I'll read a portion of it to you again. I pray that God may grant you to be strengthened in your inner being with power through God's Spirit, and that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith as you are being rooted and grounded in love. I pray that you may have the power to comprehend with all the saints what is the breadth and length and height and depth, and to know the love of Christ that surpasses knowledge, so that you may be filled with the fullness of God. What does this have to do with the all-encompassing and huge vision that was presented in the preceding chapters? For me, this prayer that lands smack dab in the middle of this little book is the piece of good news in the entire letter. In this somewhat overwhelming and intimidating book, it reminds me of two essential components of our faith. First, we are rooted and grounded in the love of Christ. Think about that. Rooted and grounded in the love of Christ. The love of Christ, it says, that is beyond our ability to comprehend with our minds, that is knowable without being knowable. A love that resisted every political principle or barrier designed to separate or protect. A love that reframed every social convention meant to define insiders and outsiders. A love that touched, healed, and made whole all that seemed unclean, broken, beyond the pale. A love that said and says nothing can separate us from the love of God. This was the love of Christ, made real and tangible in the flesh in Jesus of Nazareth. And this love did not die on the cross with Jesus. It could not be eliminated by the Roman government. Love could not be killed because it is the power of God, that creative and creating force in the universe that draws all things to itself. That's what the letter of Ephesians is saying. This power of love was, is, and always will be. For me, this is what we celebrate when we celebrate the mystery and miracle of the resurrection. That this love that was embodied in the person of Jesus still lives. It lives inside of us. This prayer reminds us that we are and can be rooted and grounded in that kind of love. Yet, it's not actually something that we can know, this kind of love. Definitely not something we can sustain on our own. Which leads me to the second piece of good news in this prayer. I pray that you may have the power to comprehend with all the saints what is the breadth and length and height and depth, and be filled with the fullness of God. All the saints, that's us. The author of Ephesians directs us to community, to comprehend together. For we know God's love most fully, most completely, most tangibly and reliably when we are gathered in community, when we commit to live into that vision, into the reality of God's dream of reconciliation. Ephesians is reminding us that God fulfills God's purpose through the work of all of God's people. We cannot in isolation remember this or do this work on our own. We need each other. The power of God's love is revealed in community. The impossible becomes possible when we live this vision together. Let me give you an example. Some of you will know this example very well. In 1995, this church voted to become an open and affirming congregation, to claim publicly and courageously that persons of every sexual orientation, race, nationality, ability, age, and gender are welcome to participate fully in all aspects of our church's life and ministry. Now, an open and affirming statement like that might not seem like such a radical move here in Berkeley in 2012, but it was then, and actually, I would argue it still is. Because in many parts of the country, even here in Berkeley, the idea that one could be both gay and Christian seems inconceivable. To proclaim that same gender-loving people, not just that they should not be discriminated against, but that people of all sexual orientations could be fully loved by and even made in the image of God is still a radical vision of hope and unity. To be gay and Christian seems sometimes still like an impossibility. And yet this church and others like it says not only is it possible, it is so. And you all stepped in faith to make it so. For me, commitments and actions like that are moments when we as the church are filled with the fullness of God. And in this way, I agree with the author of Ephesians. This is our call, to be voices for another vision, to hold open the space in our hearts, in our bodies, in our spirits, the hope that change might actually happen. We are called to step into that daring chance of reconciliation and wholeness, that it's possible to make tangible steps to make those dreams reality. Who knows where this fullness of God will call us next? What part of God's dream for wholeness and reconciliation we will be led to? In some ways, I think that's some of the discussion that's been happening about the cross and the lynching tree, or in the conversations about how we can really care for the earth, be a force for sustainability and repair for our creation. It's not an easy task to even discern, much less commit to this journey. It's scary and dangerous, counterculture, and the vision is often unclear. But we don't have to do this alone. We are called into community to discern and to do this work together. And it is in community that we can see that we are rooted and grounded in the love of Christ. We see it in each other sometimes so much more easily than we can see it in ourselves. A love that is beyond our ability to understand, but is available to us always as we step out in faith. And so I pray today with the author of Ephesians that as we gather as a community, we take in the love of Christ that is available to us. And then we look to God's vision of wholeness and unity and reconciliation as our guide. And that in this we will be filled with the fullness of God, by which God is able to accomplish so much more than we could ever hope or imagine. Amen.